They called her damaged goods, a mail-order bride with unwanted baggage, but beneath her worn traveling dress and weary eyes lived a mother's fierce love and a woman's unbroken spirit. The October wind cut sharp through the small frontier station at Cedar Ridge, carrying the bite of early winter and the scent of distant snow. Sarah clutched her 6-month-old daughter Emma closer, feeling the baby's warm breath against her neck as the last of the afternoon light faded behind the mountains. Around her, the wooden platform buzzed with nervous energy. 3 other mail-order brides had arrived on the same train, their faces bright with hope and carefully hidden fear. One by one, men approached them, ranchers and shopkeepers with calloused hands and uncertain smiles, matching faces to letters, dreams to reality. Sarah watched from her corner bench, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms, as each woman found her intended husband. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. The station master, a kind-faced man named Tom Bradley, glanced at Sarah with growing concern as the platform emptied. His weathered hands fidgeted with his pocket watch, the golden chain catching the lantern light. "Miss, your letter said someone would be meeting you." Sarah's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, a Mr. Henderson. Perhaps he's been delayed." The lie came easily now, born from weeks of protecting her pride. There had never been a Mr. Henderson. She'd spent her last coins on the train ticket west, fleeing the whispers and pointing fingers of her small Illinois town. Unmarried and with a baby, she'd become a cautionary tale mothers shared with their daughters. Emma stirred against her shoulder, making the soft cooing sounds that never failed to warm Sarah's heart. At 6 months, the baby had her father's dark hair, but Sarah's green eyes that held intelligence and warmth despite the hardships they'd witnessed. Sarah smoothed the baby's curls, marveling at how something so pure could come from such a complicated beginning. The wind picked up, rattling the station's windows and sending dried leaves skittering across the platform. Sarah pulled her thin shawl tighter around both herself and Emma, trying to shield them from the growing cold. Her traveling dress, navy blue with tiny worn spots that spoke of careful mending, had been her best dress once. Now it was simply her only dress that didn't show every stain and tear. "Storm's coming in fast," Tom muttered, scanning the darkening sky. Heavy clouds rolled over the mountains like a gray blanket, and the air carried that electric feeling that promised snow. "You can't stay out here with that baby, miss. Why don't you come inside where it's warm?" Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she nodded gratefully. The station house was small but clean, with a pot-bellied stove that radiated blessed warmth. She settled into a wooden chair near the fire, Emma stirring sleepily in her arms. Through the window, she watched the last stragglers hurry home before the storm hit. That's when she first saw him. Daniel Morrison emerged from the gathering darkness like a man walking through his own thoughts. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying invisible weight. His face, weathered by sun and wind, held the kind of quiet sadness that came from losses too deep for words. He wore working clothes, sturdy pants, a wool coat that had seen many winters, boots that spoke of long days in pastures and barns. Tom looked up from his paperwork. "Daniel, didn't expect to see you in town today." Daniel removed his hat, revealing hair the color of winter wheat, touched with premature gray at the temples. "Had business at the bank. Saw the light in here and wondered." His voice trailed off as his eyes found Sarah and Emma. Something flickered across his features, pain, perhaps, or recognition of something familiar. "This is Miss." Tom looked questioningly at Sarah. "Sarah Mitchell," she supplied, using her maiden name. "I was supposed to meet someone, but..." She let the sentence hang, pride warring with desperation. Daniel's gaze lingered on Emma, who had awakened and was studying him with the serious concentration babies brought to new faces. "Your husband?" The question hung in the warm air of the station house. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "There is no husband, just Emma and me." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, not judgment, but understanding. He'd seen enough of life to know that sometimes circumstances carve paths people never intended to walk. "The storm's going to be bad," he said, his voice gentle. "Station house gets cold at night, and that baby needs warmth." Tom nodded gravely. "I was just thinking the same thing. Can't send them out in this weather." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Sarah and Emma. The baby had grabbed his attention completely, her tiny hand reaching toward the lantern light, her face bright with innocent curiosity. When she smiled, one of those pure, unconscious baby smiles that lit up her entire face, Sarah saw Daniel's careful composure crack just slightly. "I have a ranch about 3 miles out," he said finally, his words measured and careful. "Big house, warm rooms. You and the baby could stay until the storm passes and you can make other arrangements." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She learned to be wary of men who offered help that came with unspoken expectations. But Emma chose that moment to let out a small cry of hunger, and Sarah felt her last reserves of strength wavering. "I don't want to impose. You wouldn't be," Daniel said quietly. "House is too big for one person anyway." There was something in his voice, a note of old pain that spoke of rooms that had once held other voices, other laughter. Sarah found herself studying his face more carefully, seeing past the weathered exterior to the loneliness that lived in his eyes. "The Morrison place is good people," Tom offered quietly. Daniel's been ranching that land for near 15 years. Lost his wife and baby some years back. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's decent as they come. The words explained the careful sadness Sarah had sensed, the way Daniel's eyes had both warmed and shuddered when he looked at Emma. She made her decision with the intuition that had kept her and Emma safe through months of uncertainty. "Thank you," she said simply. "We'd be grateful for shelter tonight." Daniel nodded and moved to gather her small bundle of belongings. Everything she owned in the world fit into a carpet bag and a wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother. As he lifted them, Sarah caught a glimpse of his hands, strong and careful, with old scars that spoke of hard work and the small accidents that came with ranch life. The wagon ride to Daniel's ranch was a journey through a world transformed by approaching storm. The wind had picked up fierce and cold, bending the prairie grass in waves that looked like an ocean under the darkening sky. Emma pressed close against Sarah's chest, protected by the heavy blanket Daniel had tucked around them both. "Been ranching long?" Sarah asked, trying to fill the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Since I was 22, Daniel replied, his hands steady on the reins. "Came out here with." He paused, then continued more quietly. "With my wife, Margaret. We had dreams of building something together." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly, understanding the weight of that unfinished sentence. Daniel glanced at her, surprised by the genuine sympathy in her voice. Most people either avoided the subject entirely or offered hollow platitudes that helped no one. "What about you? What brought you west?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching Emma's sleeping face in the dim light. Sometimes you reach a point where there's nothing left behind you but judgment and whispers. The West seemed like a place where people could start over. "It can be," Daniel agreed, "if you're willing to work for it." The ranch house appeared through the storm like a promise of sanctuary. Built of sturdy logs and river stone, it sat in a natural hollow that provided shelter from the worst winds. Warm light glowed in the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line before the wind caught and scattered it. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, and meant it. The house had the solid, enduring quality of something built with care and intention. Gardens, now brown with autumn, spoke of someone who'd taken time to plant flowers alongside the practical vegetables. Daniel helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady and respectful as he supported her elbow. "Margaret loved those gardens," he said, following her gaze. "Haven't had much heart for them since." Inside, the house revealed itself as a place touched by both love and loss. The main room was spacious and warm, with furniture that spoke of comfort rather than fashion. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with built-in shelves that held books and a few carefully preserved photographs. Everything was clean and orderly, but there was a careful emptiness to it, as if someone had packed away anything that held too much memory. "I'll get a fire going in the guest room," Daniel said, setting down Sarah's belongings. "There's a cradle in there that you can use for the baby." He disappeared down a hallway, and Sarah heard the sounds of him working, the scrape of kindling, the whisper of flames catching. When he returned, his face was carefully composed, but she caught a glimpse of something raw in his eyes. "The cradle," she said gently. "Was it?" "I made it," Daniel said simply. "Never got to use it." The words hung in the warm air between them, heavy with the weight of dreams that hadn't come to pass. Sarah felt Emma shift in her arms, and she looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. "She's beautiful," Daniel said softly, and Sarah realized he'd been watching them both. "She's everything to me," Sarah replied, her voice carrying all the fierce protectiveness of a mother who'd faced the world alone. "Whatever else has gone wrong in my life, Emma was worth it all." Daniel nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "Love like that, it's rare. Too many people don't know what they have until it's gone." Over the next hour, as the storm settled in earnest outside, Sarah found herself settling into the unexpected comfort of Daniel's home. He insisted she take the guest room, which was warm and welcoming with its own small fireplace and windows that looked out over the ranch's rolling pastures. The cradle sat in one corner, clearly handmade with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of love and hope. Emma seemed to sense the safety of their surroundings. She played contentedly on the soft quilt that covered the bed, her tiny hands exploring the textures of fabric and wood while Sarah tried to organize their meager belongings. When feeding time came, Daniel quietly withdrew to give them privacy, returning later with a tray of simple but nourishing food. "You don't need to wait on us," Sarah protested, but Daniel just shook his head. "You've had a long journey," he said. "Besides, it's nice to have voices in the house again." As the evening deepened, they found themselves talking in the easy way of people who recognized kindred experiences in each other. Daniel spoke of his ranch, the challenges of working the land alone, the quiet satisfaction of building something with his hands. Sarah shared carefully chosen pieces of her story, enough to explain Emma's presence without revealing all the pain that had brought them here. "What will you do?" Daniel asked eventually. "When the storm passes?" It was the question Sarah had been avoiding, the one that made her chest tight with worry. "Find work, I suppose. I can cook and clean, tend gardens. Maybe in town someone will need help." Daniel was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Town small. Not much call for hired help." Sarah's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. "Then I'll find another town, or head further west." There are opportunities for those willing to work. With a baby, Daniel said gently, and Sarah heard no judgment in his voice, only concern. Women have been raising children in difficult circumstances since the beginning of time, Sarah replied, lifting her chin with quiet determination. Emma and I will manage. Daniel studied her face in the firelight, seeing the strength that had carried her this far and the fear she was trying so hard to hide. I'm sure you will, he said finally. But sometimes managing and thriving are different things. That night, Sarah lay in the comfortable bed listening to Emma's soft breathing and the wind howling around the house. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe, not just from the storm, but from the judgment and uncertainty that had followed her like shadows. Daniel Morrison was a good man. She could see that clearly. The kind of man who helped without expecting payment, who offered shelter without conditions. But she also knew that kindness had limits, and she couldn't afford to mistake temporary sanctuary for permanent solution. Tomorrow, when the storm passed, she would need to find her own way forward. She was drifting off to sleep when she heard it, the soft sound of hammering coming from somewhere in the house. Curious, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and padded quietly down the hallway, following the sound to a room she hadn't seen before. Daniel sat at a workbench, bent over what looked like a small wooden toy, a horse, carved with the same careful attention to detail she'd seen in the cradle. Wood shavings curled at his feet, and the air smelled of pine and linseed oil. His movements were precise and meditative, the work clearly something that brought him peace. Sarah must have made a sound, because he looked up, startled. I'm sorry. Did I wake you? No, she said softly, stepping into the room. I heard the hammering and wondered. She trailed off, looking at the shelves that lined the walls. They held dozens of wooden toys, horses and cattle, tiny wagons, even a miniature rocking chair. All were beautifully crafted, but all showed the fine layer of dust that came from years of disuse. I used to make toys, Daniel said, following her gaze. For the baby that was coming. After, well, I couldn't seem to stop. Kept thinking maybe someday. Sarah moved closer to the workbench, drawn by the quality of his craftsmanship. The little horse he was working on had a flowing mane and kind eyes, carved with the loving attention of someone who understood that children saw magic in simple things. These are beautiful, she said, and meant it. Any child would treasure them. Daniel set down his tools, suddenly self-conscious. Foolish, really. Making toys for children that don't exist. Not foolish, Sarah said firmly. Hopeful. There's a difference. Something in her voice made him look up, and their eyes met in the lamplight. For a moment, the careful walls they'd both built around their hearts seemed as fragile as spun glass. Emma's getting to the age where she notices things, Sarah continued softly. Colors, shapes, textures. She'd love something like this. Daniel picked up the little horse, turning it over in his hands. Would you like me to finish it? For her. She'd be delighted, Sarah said, and was surprised by the warmth that spread through her chest at the thought of Daniel creating something specifically for her daughter. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed in the night. Sarah woke to the sound of activity outside, Daniel doing his morning chores, tending to animals that had weathered the storm in the safety of his well-built barns. Emma was awake and babbling happily, her good mood infectious despite the early hour. Sarah dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found coffee already made and the fire built up warm and welcoming. Through the window, she could see Daniel moving between the barn and paddock, his movements efficient and practiced. This was his world, she realized, the rhythm of caring for animals and land, the deep satisfaction of work that connected a man to something larger than himself. When he came in for breakfast, stamping snow from his boots and bringing the scent of cold air and hay, Sarah had managed to prepare a simple meal from the supplies she found in his well-stocked pantry. You didn't need to do that, he said, but she could see the appreciation in his eyes. You've shown us nothing but kindness, Sarah replied, settling Emma in the high chair she'd found in one of the unused rooms. It's the least I can do. As they ate, Daniel seemed different, more relaxed, as if the storm had washed away some of the careful reserve he'd worn the day before. He played with Emma, making faces that sent her into peals of delighted laughter, and Sarah felt something shift in her chest watching them together. The roads should be clear by afternoon, Daniel said eventually, and Sarah felt the weight of reality settling back around them. Yes, she agreed, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. I should start thinking about what comes next. Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching Emma try to grab his coffee cup with determined baby persistence. What if there was another option? Sarah looked up, heart suddenly beating faster. What do you mean? This ranch, Daniel said carefully. It's too much for one person. Since Margaret died, I've let too many things slide. The house is too big, too quiet. The gardens Margaret loved have gone to weeds because I can't bear to tend them. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. You need a place to stay, work that can support you and Emma. I need help. Not just with the ranch work, but with making this place feel like a home again instead of just a place where I sleep. Sarah's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. Are you offering me work, Mr. Morrison? I'm offering you a place, Daniel said quietly. A real place, not just temporary shelter. You'd have your own room, space for Emma to grow and play. In return, you'd help with the house, maybe the gardens come spring. It wouldn't be charity, You'd be earning your keep, and then some. Sarah stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. And Emma. Daniel's face softened as he looked at the baby, who was now contentedly chewing on a piece of soft bread. Children belong on ranches. They need space to run and explore, animals to love, work that teaches them the value of caring for something. People will talk, Sarah said quietly. An unmarried woman living on your ranch. People always talk, Daniel replied. Usually about things that aren't their business. What matters is whether the arrangement works for us. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finding exactly what she hadn't dared to hope for. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'd like that very much. Over the following weeks, Sarah discovered that life on the Morrison Ranch had a rhythm that suited her deeply. Her days began before dawn, when she would rise to start coffee and begin breakfast while Emma still slept peacefully in the beautiful cradle. Daniel would come in from his morning chores with winded cheeks and stories of the animals. The mare who was expecting a foal in spring, the ornery bull who'd figured out how to open gates, the barn cat who'd adopted a litter of orphaned kittens. Emma thrived in the ranch environment. The wide spaces and clean air seemed to invigorate her, and she grew more alert and interactive each day. Daniel had finished the wooden horse, painting it with careful attention to detail, and Emma's face had lit up with pure joy when he presented it to her. She carried it everywhere now, babbling to it in the serious way babies had of conducting important conversations. Sarah found herself falling into domestic rhythms she'd never experienced before. Cooking for 2 adults meant she could prepare real meals instead of the quick, simple food she'd managed when it was just her and Emma. The ranch house had a well-equipped kitchen, and Daniel proved to be an appreciative audience for her experiments with preserved vegetables and game meat. But it was the quiet moments that surprised her most, evenings when Daniel would sit by the fire working on his wood carving while Sarah mended clothes or read from one of the many books on his shelves. Emma would play contentedly on the soft rug, surrounded by the growing collection of toys Daniel seemed unable to stop making for her. You don't have to keep carving things for her, Sarah said one evening, watching him put finishing touches on a tiny wooden duck. I like to, Daniel admitted. Haven't had reason to finish anything in years. It feels good to make something that brings joy instead of just sitting on a shelf gathering dust. Sarah understood. She'd begun to tend Margaret's abandoned gardens, not because Daniel asked her to, but because something in her responded to the idea of bringing life back to spaces that had been forgotten. Under the dead growth of neglect, she'd found the bones of carefully planned flower beds and herb gardens. Come spring, with patience and care, they would bloom again. The first test of their arrangement came on a Saturday morning when Daniel returned from town with a grim expression and news that made Sarah's stomach clench with familiar anxiety. There's talk, he said without preamble, setting down supplies on the kitchen table. Sarah's hands stilled on the bread she'd been kneading. What kind of talk? The kind you'd expect. Questions about why I've got an unmarried woman living in my house. Suggestions about what people think is really going on here. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from anger that the peace they'd built could be threatened by people who knew nothing about their situation. What do you want me to do? Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then at Emma, who was sitting in her high chair seriously attempting to feed herself mashed vegetables. I want you to ignore it. This is your home now, Sarah. Don't let other people's small minds make you feel otherwise. The support in his voice strengthened her resolve. It might get worse before it gets better. Probably will, Daniel agreed. But I've lived in this community for 15 years. People know what kind of man I am. The ones whose opinions matter will judge us by our actions, not their assumptions. He was right, but Sarah still felt the weight of scrutiny when she ventured into town for supplies. She held her head high and spoke politely to everyone, but she could feel the whispers that followed in her wake. Some of the women were kind. Mrs. Patterson at the general store always had a smile for Emma, and Dr. Reynolds' wife made a point of asking after Sarah's health with genuine concern. But others made their disapproval clear with pursed lips and pointed comments about proper behavior and the sanctity of marriage. Sarah weathered their judgment with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through the worst of her troubles back east, but she couldn't deny that it hurt. The breaking point came on a particularly difficult day in late November. Sarah had ventured into town alone, leaving Emma with Daniel while she handled several errands that would be easier without a baby in tow. At the general store, she'd overheard a conversation between 2 women that left her shaking with anger and hurt. It's disgraceful, one was saying in the loud whisper people used when they wanted to be overheard. That Morrison boy taking up with some fallen woman and her bastard child. His poor wife would be spinning in her grave. Someone should speak to the pastor, the other replied. This kind of behavior reflects poorly on the whole community. Sarah had completed her purchases with as much dignity as she could muster and loaded her supplies into the wagon with hands that trembled slightly from suppressed emotion. The ride home gave her time to think, and by the time she reached the ranch, her resolve had crystallized into something hard and protective. Daniel was in the barn when she returned, Emma strapped to his chest in a carrier Sarah had fashioned from soft fabric. The sight of her daughter content and safe in his care should have warmed her heart, but the afternoon's encounter had left her feeling raw and vulnerable. How did it go in town? Daniel asked, immediately noticing something in her expression. Sarah busied herself unloading supplies, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Fine. Got everything we needed. Daniel studied her face, reading the signs of distress she was trying to hide. What happened? Nothing that hasn't happened before, Sarah said, attempting to sound casual. Just the usual talk. Sarah. Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. What happened? She told him, the words coming out in a rush of anger and hurt. Daniel listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grim as she described the women's comments and their suggestions about involving the pastor. I won't have you subjected to that kind of treatment, he said when she finished. This is ridiculous. It's not ridiculous, Sarah replied, exhaustion creeping into her voice. It's reality. An unmarried woman living with a man, raising a child born out of wedlock. Of course there's going to be talk. Maybe I should start looking for other arrangements. No. Daniel's voice was sharp enough to startle Emma, who had been dozing against his chest. He gentled his tone immediately, but his eyes remained intense. No, Sarah. You're not leaving because of other people's narrow minds. But if it's causing problems for you, the only problem it's causing is making me realize how much this place has come to depend on you, Daniel interrupted. How much I've come to depend on you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither had been quite ready to acknowledge. Sarah felt her heart speed up, hope and fear warring in her chest. Daniel, she said softly, what are you saying? He was quiet for a moment, his hands gentle on Emma's back as he seemed to gather his thoughts. I'm saying that Margaret's been gone for 3 years, and for the first time since then, this house feels like a home instead of a monument to grief. I'm saying that Emma has brought laughter back to these rooms, and you've brought. He paused, searching for words. You brought life back to my life. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. But we're not. I mean, this arrangement isn't. It could be, Daniel said quietly. If you wanted it to be. The proposition hung between them like a bridge that could either connect them or burn down everything they'd built. Sarah looked at this man who'd offered them shelter, who carved toys for her daughter and defended their presence in his home against community judgment. Are you asking me to marry you? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm asking if you consider it, Daniel replied carefully. Not because of what people are saying, and not out of obligation, but because these weeks with you and Emma have shown me what I've been missing. A real partnership, a family, a future that includes more than just getting through each day. Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. And Emma. Daniel's face softened as he looked down at the baby sleeping against his chest. Emma would be my daughter in every way that matters. She already is, in my heart. The simple declaration broke something open in Sarah's chest, all the careful walls she'd built around her heart crumbling in the face of such generous, uncomplicated love. This wasn't a man offering to tolerate her child as part of a bargain. This was a man who had already fallen in love with her daughter and wanted to give her his name and protection. Yes, she whispered, then stronger. Yes, Daniel. I would very much like to marry you. The wedding took place on a clear December morning with Dr. Reynolds and his wife serving as witnesses. Sarah wore her best dress, the navy blue she'd traveled in, but cleaned and pressed and made beautiful by her happiness. Daniel had offered to buy her something new, but she declined. This dress had carried her through her darkest times and brought her to this moment of joy. It seemed fitting that it should witness her new beginning as well. Emma, now crawling and pulling herself up on furniture, wore a tiny dress that Sarah had sewn from fabric Daniel had insisted on buying. She babbled happily throughout the short ceremony, charming everyone present with her sunny disposition and complete lack of understanding about the significance of the occasion. The pastor, a kind man named Reverend Thomas, had initially expressed concerns about the hasty nature of the marriage and the unconventional circumstances that had brought them together. But after spending time with Daniel and Sarah, seeing the genuine affection between them and Daniel's obvious devotion to Emma, he'd agreed to perform the ceremony. Marriage is about creating a family based on love and commitment, he said during the brief service. The forms that love takes are less important than the sincerity with which it's given. As they exchanged simple gold bands, Daniel's had been his father's, and Sarah's was new, purchased specially for the occasion. Sarah felt the final pieces of her old life falling away. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, the fallen woman with the illegitimate child. She was Sarah Morrison, wife and mother, part of a family that had chosen each other deliberately and completely. The reception was small, just the Reynoldses and a few other couples who had become friends during Sarah's time on the ranch. Mrs. Patterson had made a cake, and Daniel's nearest neighbor, an elderly rancher named Jim Wheeler, had provided a bottle of genuine champagne he'd been saving for a special occasion. To new beginnings, Dr. Reynolds toasted, raising his glass. And to the courage it takes to build something beautiful from difficult circumstances. As winter deepened, Sarah discovered that married life with Daniel felt both completely natural and wonderfully new. They were partners in the truest sense. He handled the ranch work while she managed the household, but they consulted each other on decisions and shared the daily work of caring for Emma and maintaining their home. Emma had taken her first steps the week after the wedding, using the coffee table Daniel had built to pull herself upright and then launching herself towards Sarah's outstretched arms with the fearless confidence of a child who knew she would be caught. The moment had felt symbolic somehow, this little girl who had never known her biological father taking her first independent steps in a home where she was completely loved and wanted. Daniel proved to be a natural father. He had infinite patience for Emma's explorations and mishaps, and she clearly adored him. She learned to say Dada before Mama, much to Sarah's amused chagrin, and would clap her hands with delight whenever she heard his voice or saw him coming through the door. She's going to be spoiled rotten, Sarah commented one evening, watching Daniel patiently help Emma stack wooden blocks only to have her knock them down with squeals of laughter. Good, Daniel replied, his eyes warm with affection as Emma began the process all over again. She deserves to be spoiled a little. She's had enough uncertainty in her young life. As spring approached, Sarah began working in earnest on Margaret's abandoned gardens. Daniel had offered to hire men to clear the overgrown beds, but Sarah preferred to do the work herself, discovering what Margaret had planted by carefully removing weeds and dead growth. It was therapeutic work, and she found herself thinking often about the woman who had planned these gardens, what she'd hoped to accomplish, what dreams she'd held for the life she and Daniel would build together. Sarah felt no jealousy toward Margaret's memory. Instead, she felt a strange sense of continuity, as if she were carrying forward something important that had been interrupted but not destroyed. She would have liked you, Daniel said one afternoon, finding Sarah kneeling in what had once been an herb garden, carefully transplanting seedlings she'd started in the kitchen window. How can you be sure? Sarah asked, sitting back on her heels and pushing a strand of hair from her face. Because you're both women who see potential in things other people might overlook, Daniel replied. She saw potential in this land when it was nothing but prairie grass and rocks. You saw potential in me when I was nothing but a grieving widower who'd forgotten how to live. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. You were never nothing, Daniel. You were just waiting. We both were, he agreed, reaching down to help her to her feet, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right reason to start over. The first big test of their new family came in late spring when Daniel's brother Robert arrived unexpectedly from Denver. Sarah had heard about Robert but never met him, Daniel's younger brother who had become a successful businessman in the city and had strong opinions about how people should live their lives. Robert was everything Daniel wasn't: polished, well-dressed, quick with words and judgment. He greeted Sarah politely but coolly, and she could see him taking inventory of their home and circumstances with the calculating eye of someone who measured worth in material terms. So you're the mail-order bride who's captured my brother's heart, he said during dinner, his tone light but with an undercurrent that made Sarah's spine straighten. I'm Daniel's wife, Sarah replied evenly, and Emma's mother. The circumstances that brought us together matter less than what we've built since then. Robert smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course. Though one does wonder what would have happened if you'd found a husband waiting at that train station after all. The comment hit its mark, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. But before she could respond, Daniel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. That's enough, Robert. His tone was quiet, but carried unmistakable authority. Sarah is my wife and Emma is my daughter. How we came to be a family is nobody's business but ours. Robert raised his hands in mock surrender. I meant no offense. I'm simply concerned about your reputation, your standing in the community. My standing in the community is based on 15 years of honest work and fair dealing, Daniel interrupted. The people whose opinions matter know what kind of man I am and what kind of woman Sarah is. The conversation moved to safer topics after that, but Sarah could feel Robert's assessment continuing throughout his visit. He was polite to Emma, even charming in his way, but Sarah sensed his disapproval of their unconventional family. On his last morning, Robert made one final attempt to express his concerns. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she overheard him talking to Daniel on the front porch. I just think you're settling, Dan. You could have any respectable woman in 3 counties. Why tie yourself to someone with such a complicated past? Daniel's response was immediate and firm. Because love isn't about finding someone without complications, Robert. It's about finding someone whose complications you're willing to share, whose happiness matters more than your own convenience. But the child is the best thing that ever happened to me, Daniel said, his voice carrying a warmth that made Sarah's chest tight with emotion. Emma brought laughter back to this house and reminded me what it means to hope for the future instead of just mourning the past. There was a pause, then Robert's voice, quieter now. You really love them. More than I thought possible, Daniel replied simply. They're my family, Robert. The family I choose and the family that chose me back. After Robert left, Daniel found Sarah in the garden, ostensibly tending to her seedlings but clearly lost in thought. Emma was napping in a basket nearby, her face peaceful in the dappled shade of the apple tree Daniel had planted years ago. You heard, he said, settling beside her on the garden bench he'd built the week before. I heard, Sarah confirmed. I'm sorry he doesn't approve of me. His approval isn't required, Daniel said firmly. Robert means well, but he's forgotten that the best things in life can't be measured by conventional standards. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching a bee work its way through the lavender she'd planted along the garden's border. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different? If I'd been a proper mail-order bride with respectable circumstances? Daniel considered the question seriously. I think if you'd been different, I wouldn't have fallen in love with you. It's your strength, your courage, your refusal to be defeated by difficult circumstances that drew me to you. A woman who hadn't faced real hardship might not have appreciated what we have here. He reached over and took her hand, calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Besides, if things had been different, I might not have been ready for you. Grief has its own timeline, and I needed to work through mine before I could open my heart to someone new. As summer deepened, their life together found its natural rhythm. Sarah's gardens bloomed in spectacular fashion, filling the ranch with color and fragrance that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. Emma learned to walk steadily and began developing a vocabulary that included mama, dada, kitty for the barn cats, and horsey for the gentle mare Daniel had chosen specifically for her to learn to ride when she was older. The community's initial disapproval had largely faded, replaced by recognition that the Morrison Ranch was thriving under Sarah's influence and that Emma was clearly a happy, well-cared-for child. Sarah had proven herself through consistent kindness and competence, volunteering to help with church events and community gatherings, always ready to lend a hand when neighbors needed assistance. Dr. Reynolds' wife had become a particular friend, often stopping by for tea and conversation while their children played together. "You've done something remarkable here," she told Sarah one afternoon as they watched Emma toddle around the garden, chattering to herself and carefully examining each flower. "I've just tried to build a good life for my family," Sarah replied, but she knew what her friend meant. The ranch had become a place of warmth and welcome, a home that reflected the love and care of the people who lived there. That evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into the beautiful cradle that had waited so long for a child to occupy it, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this place. A year ago, she'd been desperate and alone, carrying her baby toward an uncertain future with nothing but hope and determination to sustain her. Now she had a husband who loved her unconditionally, a daughter who was thriving in the safety and security of a real home, and a community that had come to accept and respect her. The transformation felt miraculous, but she knew it had been built through daily choices: Daniel's choice to offer shelter, her choice to stay and build something lasting, their mutual choice to create a family based on love rather than convention. Daniel appeared in the doorway, drawn by the soft sound of Sarah's voice as she sang Emma to sleep. The lullaby was one Margaret had written, found in a music box in the room that had once been intended as a nursery. Sarah had discovered it while cleaning and had asked Daniel if she could learn it. Now it had become part of Emma's bedtime routine, a connection between past and present that honored what had been while celebrating what was. "She's getting so big," Daniel whispered, moving to stand beside Sarah as they watched Emma's eyes flutter closed. "Too big," Sarah agreed softly. "Sometimes I wish I could keep her exactly this age forever, old enough to be interesting, young enough to still fit in my arms." Daniel slipped his arm around Sarah's waist, pulling her close against his side. "There will be other children," he said quietly. "Other babies to rock in this cradle." Sarah looked up at him, seeing the hope and love in his eyes. They talked about expanding their family, but carefully, understanding that such dreams required both hearts to be ready. "Are you saying you'd like that?" she asked. "I'm saying I'd like whatever the future brings us," Daniel replied. "More children, if we're blessed with them. Emma growing up strong and happy. Growing old together on this land we've made into home." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot, holding their newborn son while Emma played at her feet. Little Thomas Daniel Morrison had arrived during a gentle snowfall in February, and from his first cry, it was clear he had inherited his father's quiet strength and his mother's determined spirit. Emma had adapted to her new role as big sister with the generous heart that characterized everything she did. She insisted on helping with every aspect of Thomas's care, from bringing diapers to singing the lullabies she'd learned by heart. Watching her daughter shower love on her baby brother, Sarah marveled at the resilience of children and their capacity for joy. "Mama," Emma said now, tugging on Sarah's skirt. "Baby hungry?" "I think he might be," Sarah agreed, settling into the rocking chair Daniel had made specially for nursing. Emma climbed into the chair beside her, carefully positioning herself so she could see Thomas without disturbing his feeding. Daniel found them there an hour later, all three of them dozing in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the nursery windows. The sight of his family, whole, healthy, and completely content, filled him with the kind of gratitude that made a man believe in providence. Sarah opened her eyes as she sensed his presence, smiling with the sleepy contentment of a woman completely secure in her place in the world. "Good day?" she asked softly. "Perfect day," Daniel replied, meaning it completely. Every day is perfect now. As the seasons turned and their children grew, Sarah often thought about that desperate young woman who had sat in the train station holding her baby and wondering what would become of them. That woman would never have imagined this future: a loving husband, a thriving family, a home that was everything she dreamed of but never dared to expect. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Daniel's careful stewardship of the land and animals, combined with Sarah's management of the household and her increasingly famous gardens, created a place of abundance and beauty. Neighbors came to buy Sarah's preserves and seedlings, and she began taking on occasional work as a midwife, skills she learned from necessity during Emma's birth proving valuable to other women in the community. Emma grew into a confident, joyful child who moved between her parents' worlds with ease, helping Daniel with the animals, learning to ride almost before she could walk properly, and working beside Sarah in the gardens that had become her particular passion. Thomas followed in his sister's footsteps, though with his own distinct personality that combined his father's thoughtful nature with his mother's determination. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Sarah and Daniel would sit on the porch swing he'd built overlooking the gardens and pastures. Sometimes they talked about their plans for the ranch, the children's futures, the small dramas and joys of daily life. Other times they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked one evening as they watched Emma chase fireflies in the gathering dusk while Thomas crawled determinedly after a patient barn cat. Miss what? Daniel asked, though he thought he knew what she meant. The quiet. The solitude. Before we came along and filled your house with noise and chaos. Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I thought I liked the quiet, he said finally. But I was confusing quiet with emptiness. There's a difference between peaceful solitude and the kind of silence that comes from loss. He turned to look at her, this woman who had transformed his life so completely. What we have now, this is the good kind of quiet. The kind that comes from contentment rather than absence. Sarah leaned into his shoulder, watching their children play in the yard that had once echoed only with memories. I love you, Daniel Morrison, she said softly. I love you too, Sarah Morrison, he replied, and the words carried all the weight of the journey that had brought them together and the future they were building one day at a time. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah reflected on the unexpected ways life could unfold. She'd come west as a desperate woman with limited options, carrying a child she'd been told was a burden and a shame. She'd found instead a man who saw her daughter as a gift and herself as a partner worthy of respect and love. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been built through countless small moments, shared meals, quiet conversations, the daily work of creating a home together. It had been strengthened through challenges met and overcome, through the community's gradual acceptance and their own deepening commitment to each other. Now, watching her children play in the safety of their own yard while her husband's arm encircled her shoulders, Sarah understood that the greatest journeys weren't always about traveling far distances. Sometimes they were about finding your way home to a place you'd never been but somehow always belonged. Tell us in the comments what you think about the choices we make that lead to unexpected blessings, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, love, and new beginnings in the American West.